The eyes are the only part of the brain you can see without surgery. That line sounds poetic until you sit with what it actually means. Because if the eyes are exposed brain tissue, then a gaze is not a look. It's a signal. It's information leaving one nervous system and entering another. And some signals don't soothe. Some interrupt. Some destabilize entire belief systems. Here's the part most people aren't ready to hear. This wasn't paranoia, superstition, or ego. This was observed, measured, documented behavior. Human beings have spent decades studying eye contact, pupil dilation, gaze duration, micro-freezes, and neurological response patterns. In controlled environments, researchers found that certain gazes don't invite connection. They disrupt internal coherence. Heart rates spike, cognitive load increases, defensive behavior activates. People become irrational, aggressive, or oddly submissive. Not because of what was said. Nothing was said. That's the problem. You weren't doing anything dramatic. You weren't staring people down like a movie villain. You were just looking, calmly, normally. And somehow, rooms shifted. Conversations bent. Confident people lost their footing. That's when the experts got involved. Not to flatter you, but to understand why their usual psychological tools stopped working in your presence. And let's be honest for a second. If a look alone can unsettle someone, the problem was never the look. It was the structure holding their identity together with hope, habit, and a shocking amount of denial. Your gaze didn't attack their reality. It simply refused to help them maintain it. There's also something darkly funny about the whole thing. Imagine needing a clipboard, a lab coat, and a funding grant just to explain why someone looking at you calmly made you question your entire sense of authority. That's not intimidation. That's exposure with receipts. This isn't about being intense. It's about being unfiltered. A gaze that doesn't adjust to comfort, hierarchy, or social theater. A gaze that doesn't ask permission to see clearly. And once that kind of awareness enters a system built on illusion, the system doesn't adapt. It fractures. So, if you've ever noticed people acting strange around you for no obvious reason, understand this. Some realities aren't strong. They're just agreed upon. And the moment someone looks without agreeing, the whole thing starts to wobble. Number one, they didn't study your words. They studied how you look back at the world. Your gaze is more than sight. It's a silent language that communicates far beyond spoken words. It's steady, unwavering, and precise in ways most people can't even register consciously. That's why they didn't bother with your words. Words can be rehearsed, manipulated, or disguised. But your eyes, they tell the truth, whether you want them to or not. And anyone who has spent their life trying to control, deceive, or manipulate will recognize it instantly. There's no hiding behind charm, no masking with humor, no redirecting with flattery. Your gaze doesn't negotiate, it doesn't bow. It sees the patterns beneath the surface. What makes it extraordinary is its quiet, almost unnoticeable power. People in authority, people who think they hold all the cards, react instinctively when they meet someone who sees without fear or bias. Their strategies, their tactics, even their self-confidence, it all falters. They expect compliance, distraction, or some kind of submission, and instead, they get observation, clarity, and awareness. That's a kind of exposure that doesn't scream. It doesn't demand, it just exists. And that alone is destabilizing. They studied you because a gaze like yours doesn't just watch. It interrogates without a question. It analyzes without a calculation. It measures without judgment. Every subtle shift, every unspoken intent, every hidden motive is noted. People who rely on illusions, pretenses, or constructed realities feel a subtle panic when someone simply looks at them the way you do. You become a mirror they can't cover, a reality they can't manipulate, and a truth they can't escape. It's fascinating and terrifying at the same time. Terrifying for those who depend on compliance and fragile structures. Fascinating because it's a natural skill you didn't need to study, a weapon you didn't need to forge. Your gaze is a presence that doesn't need to announce itself, yet it unravels entire frameworks built around lies, power plays, and unchallenged authority. And that's why they couldn't stop studying you, because they knew that what you see with your eyes alone could dismantle everything they thought they controlled. Number 2, your eyes don't react emotionally. They register truth before emotion forms. Most people feel first and think later. Their eyes follow their emotions, not their understanding. Yours work in the opposite direction. Before fear kicks in, before sympathy shows up, before anger even has a chance to rise, your eyes have already logged what's real. That split-second difference changes everything. It's the reason situations that overwhelm others don't overwhelm you in the same way. You don't freeze, fawn, or flare up on command. You pause, and in that pause, you see what's actually happening. That pause is unsettling to people who rely on emotional momentum to control outcomes. Manipulators move fast on purpose. They want reactions, not awareness. They depend on shock, urgency, guilt, or charm to bypass discernment. But when your eyes don't immediately respond, their rhythm breaks. They sense it before they can explain it. Something isn't landing. Something isn't working. And that's when they start to feel exposed. Your gaze processes facts before feelings. Tone, timing, contradictions, body language and motive all register at once. While others are busy reacting to how something feels, you're already clocking what doesn't add up. By the time an emotional response would normally appear, the truth has already been categorized. That doesn't make you cold, it makes you precise. And precision is dangerous in environments built on confusion. This is why people sometimes accuse you of being distant, intimidating, or unreadable. They're not uncomfortable with you. They're uncomfortable with the absence of control they feel around you. They can't steer your emotions because you haven't handed them the wheel. Your eyes stay steady while their internal narrative starts to wobble. They expected agreement, outrage, sympathy, or submission. Instead, they got assessment. There's also a deeper layer to this. When truth registers before emotion, lies don't get time to settle. They don't get to become familiar. They don't get softened by empathy or rationalization. They are seen as they are, immediately. That's why people who live in half-truths or self-deception react so strongly to you. Your gaze short-circuits the delay they rely on. In the end, it's not that your eyes lack emotion, it's that they refuse to be hijacked. And in a world where emotional manipulation is currency, that kind of clarity feels like a threat. Number 3. Experts realized your gaze collapses false hierarchies. Hierarchy isn't always about titles, roles, or authority. Most of the time, it's a carefully maintained illusion. People agree to it because it keeps things predictable, manageable, and comfortable. They follow rules, defer, and perform respect because the structure tells them to. But your gaze doesn't play along with any of that. It doesn't acknowledge superiority or enforce submission. It simply observes, and in doing so, it exposes the cracks in the system. That's why experts noticed it. They didn't just see a person looking at others, they saw a presence that quietly dismantled the scaffolding people depend on to feel secure. When someone meets your eyes, the invisible agreements that prop up social hierarchies start to wobble. A boss who thrives on unquestioned authority suddenly feels unsure. A group of peers who rely on conformity begins to split. People who thought they were untouchable find themselves nervously recalculating. You're not loud, you're not confrontational. Yet your gaze makes people aware that their position wasn't as solid as they believed. It's subtle, but devastating. The system isn't collapsing because of words or actions. It's collapsing because it's being seen for what it is. What's remarkable is how unconscious this effect is. You're not trying to dominate, control, or intimidate. You're just present. Your attention isn't selective in the way most people's are. You don't seek validation, align with power, or avoid conflict. That absence of participation is like a glitch in the matrix for those dependent on hierarchy. They expect compliance, respect, or fear. And when it doesn't come, the illusion cracks. This kind of gaze doesn't just dismantle authority, it exposes the way humans have been trained to accept it blindly. It forces them to confront the truth. Most hierarchies survive not because of merit or power, but because people agree to pretend. And once someone refuses to play along, the entire structure feels fragile. That's why your presence alone is enough to shake rooms, organizations, and social circles. It's not aggression, it's awareness, and awareness doesn't negotiate. Number 4, your gaze forces people to confront who they actually are. Most people go through life hiding behind layers, habits, roles, excuses, and performances that shield them from the parts of themselves they don't want to see. They assume no one notices the cracks, the inconsistencies, the contradictions between who they claim to be and who they actually are. Then they meet you. And your gaze doesn't accept pretense. It doesn't glance over flaws, ignore contradictions, or flatter insecurities. It looks straight at reality, and that makes people squirm in ways they don't understand. Your eyes don't lie, and they don't look away. That simple refusal to participate in someone's self-deception becomes a mirror that can't be polished or ignored. People suddenly realize that the narratives they've been telling themselves, the stories that justify cowardice, manipulation, or avoidance, don't hold up under your observation. That's when shame, rage, or panic surfaces. Some try to laugh it off, some try to distract, some lash out. None of it works because the gaze doesn't waver, doesn't soften, and doesn't validate illusions. It just sees clearly. What's extraordinary about this is how unconscious it is. You're not targeting anyone. You're not pointing fingers. You're not performing judgment. You're just looking. And yet in that act alone, you trigger a reckoning. People confront the truth they've avoided for years, the truth that doesn't fit into their convenient self-image. That confrontation is messy, it's uncomfortable, and it's terrifying to those who have invested everything in pretending they are someone they're not. Your gaze becomes a force they can't control, a silent pressure they can't negotiate. It doesn't shame, they shame themselves. It doesn't expose, they expose themselves. And that's why your presence can be so destabilizing. People who have lived comfortably in self-deception are suddenly forced into clarity. And clarity doesn't come with instructions or excuses. It just is. Your gaze doesn't need to move, speak, or act. It simply exists, and in existing, it dismantles falsehoods and reveals truth in its rawest form. That is why your eyes don't just see, they awaken reality, and some realities aren't ready for awakening. Number 5. They discovered your gaze activates unresolved trauma in others. Trauma lives quietly beneath the surface for most people. It doesn't always scream, but it waits, like a shadow, ready to flare when triggered. Your gaze doesn't trigger it with words or actions. It triggers it by presence. There's a clarity in the way you look at people that cuts past the distractions, the bravado, and the rehearsed defenses. You don't need to say a thing. People's pasts, the things they've buried or ignored, begin to rise to the surface because your eyes see through the barriers they've spent years building. What's remarkable is how instant and involuntary the effect is. The experts noticed that even subtle interactions caused physiological responses, a sudden tensing of muscles, micro-expressions of fear or guilt, slight shifts in breathing. Those reactions aren't conscious. They're deep, hardwired reminders of experiences they've avoided. And your gaze doesn't just notice those reactions, it amplifies them. It holds attention without judgment, without indulgence, without excuse, and that's exactly what makes it so destabilizing. People are forced to meet what they've been avoiding. They feel the discomfort of being fully seen, and that discomfort often manifests as frustration, anger, or an attempt to assert control. It's not personal. You're not doing anything aggressive or manipulative. You're just present, just watching, just registering. That's the terrifying part for those who live with unhealed wounds. They aren't used to being observed without interference or distraction. They're used to people looking away, excusing behaviors or glossing over reality. But your gaze doesn't comply with that pattern. It refuses to ignore, refuse to soften, and refuse to let them hide. And that's why your presence can feel like a crisis for some people. The unresolved trauma they carry isn't yours, but it is activated by the simple fact that you see clearly. Their defenses fail. Their rehearsed narratives crumble. And for those who rely on avoidance as survival, your gaze doesn't just reveal truth, it forces confrontation. People feel exposed, unsettled, and unmoored, and all you did was exist and look. That is the power hidden in your eyes, a force that awakens buried realities without a single word spoken. Number 6, you don't look to connect, you look to understand. Most people's eyes are transactional. They search for approval, empathy, recognition, or a reaction they can control. Your gaze doesn't operate like that. You're not scanning for validation, and you're not fishing for emotional reciprocity. You're observing, assessing, and absorbing patterns. You're trying to understand the motives, the contradictions, the unspoken truths that shape behavior. That's why your presence feels different, sometimes even disarming. People instinctively sense that you aren't there to play their game, and that breaks their usual rhythm. When someone expects connection but gets understanding instead, it creates a subtle kind of pressure. They realize quickly that you aren't entertained by performances, that you aren't easily swayed by charm, and that emotional manipulation won't work. You don't mirror or placate. You don't reassure or flatter. You simply register. That registration is not passive. It's active observation that quietly exposes patterns, inconsistencies, and vulnerabilities. It forces people to confront themselves because they know deep down that you see beyond their surface-level persona. This is why your gaze is so effective and unnerving at the same time. People who rely on social theater, posturing, or carefully constructed identities begin to feel uncomfortable. They try to fill the space with words, gestures, or explanations, but your focus doesn't waver. You aren't judging, but you aren't distracted either. That combination makes it impossible for them to hide. Understanding is heavier than connection. Connection can soothe, connection can flatter. But understanding strips pretense. It forces accountability to one's own behavior and choices, whether the other person is ready for it or not. People feel exposed because they sense they are being decoded without compromise. That's why your gaze unsettles manipulators and recalibrates environments around you. You aren't just looking at someone, you're perceiving their blueprint, and that level of awareness doesn't exist in most interactions. Your gaze doesn't seek approval or comfort, it seeks clarity. That clarity becomes contagious, revealing truth in ways people rarely expect, and it shifts dynamics silently, deeply, and irreversibly. Number 7, your gaze doesn't chase permission to exist. Most people move through life seeking approval. They adjust their words, their posture, their presence, even their thoughts, to fit expectations. They seek nods, smiles, validation, and reassurance because survival has been built around agreement. Your gaze doesn't participate in that system. It doesn't need permission to exist. You don't tilt, soften, or accommodate just to make others comfortable. You don't ask to be acknowledged or accepted. You simply are. And that alone disrupts the unspoken rules people rely on to feel in control. That refusal to ask permission carries enormous weight. When you enter a space, people unconsciously register that you aren't negotiating for approval. They notice that no one is telling you where to stand, how to speak, or who to align with. That subtle independence triggers something primal. Those who operate through manipulation, hierarchy, or coercion feel threatened because their usual levers, guilt, flattery, intimidation, don't reach you. Your presence doesn't comply, and that absence of compliance shakes foundations they've relied on for years. What makes this extraordinary is how quietly powerful it is. You're not asserting dominance, but the lack of neediness speaks volumes. People start overthinking interactions, recalculating their strategies, and testing boundaries they normally assume will hold. The space you occupy becomes your own, not because of conflict or force, but because you never surrendered it. This is why your gaze destabilizes rooms, conversations, and relationships without effort. It's not aggressive, it's sovereign. People who try to define reality through consensus, approval, or groupthink suddenly feel pressure. They expect compliance, but you don't comply. They hope for influence, but your attention can't be bought or directed. You exist independently of their expectations, and that independence alone dismantles illusions. Your gaze proves a simple truth most people overlook. You don't need permission to be here, to be aware, or to observe clearly. And when someone else's control depends entirely on permission being given, that simple refusal to ask becomes disruptive, revealing, and quietly unstoppable. Number 8. Experts noticed your eyes stay calm where others dissociate. Most people don't maintain clarity when chaos hits. When pressure mounts, when fear or anger rises, the instinct is to flinch, to avoid, to disconnect from reality in order to cope. That's normal. It's human. But your eyes don't follow that script. They stay steady. They remain grounded while the room, the situation, even the people around you seem to spin out of control. That calm isn't passive. It's active awareness. You're registering, analyzing, and observing without being hijacked by fear or impulse. That difference is not subtle. It's seismic, and the experts couldn't ignore it. What makes this so destabilizing to others is that it exposes their own instability. When someone expects others to mirror panic, uncertainty, or submission, your calm becomes a mirror that reflects their overreactions. People are conditioned to assume that chaos will spread, that fear will ripple, that control is always temporary and fragile. But when you meet that pressure with stillness, it breaks their expectations. They realize that their scripts, their manipulations, their dominance, and their narratives don't reach you. You're unaffected by the emotional contagion they rely on to maintain order and influence. Your gaze in these moments communicates more than any words could. It signals that you are anchored to truth, reality, and observation rather than to panic or performance. That presence alone is disorienting because it forces others to confront the difference between their reactive reality and your composed one. People don't know how to respond. They can't escalate you, manipulate you, or distract you in ways that normally work. Their strategies fail not because you resist. They fail because you exist in a state they cannot replicate or manipulate. This is why your calm is more than composure. It's a disruption. It's a measure of control that others recognize instinctively, whether consciously or not. In moments of confusion, conflict, or pressure, your eyes don't betray fear, uncertainty, or hesitation. They stay rooted, and in doing so, they quietly unravel the fragile structures of influence, expectation, and authority around you. That quiet, unshakable clarity is rare, and it is impossible to ignore. Number 9. Your gaze refuses emotional bargaining. Most interactions are built on exchange. People give what they expect to get, they manipulate feelings, and they trade reactions like currency. They expect to negotiate emotions, to provoke responses, to buy compliance or sympathy. Your gaze doesn't play that game. It doesn't plead, argue, soften, or exaggerate. It doesn't seek agreement, reassurance, or validation. It simply observes. And that refusal to participate in emotional trading is devastating to those who rely on it to feel in control. When people try to manipulate, they rely on reactions: fear, guilt, flattery, or anger. They calculate how much they need to provoke or soothe to get the outcome they want. Your eyes don't give them that leverage. You don't flinch, you don't overreact, you don't placate or fight. You just register what is happening in full clarity without negotiating for comfort. That absence of compliance is a form of quiet power that most people can't withstand. They begin to feel off balance because the usual rules don't apply. Your gaze makes them realize that emotional currency has no value here. Their threats, their charm, their coercion, even their subtle manipulations, all fail because you are not hooked into the exchange. You're present without submission, aware without negotiation. That kind of presence is rare, and it's deeply unsettling for people who depend on influence through feelings rather than facts or awareness. This is why your gaze doesn't just observe, it exposes. It reveals who is performing, who is hiding, who is trying to manipulate, and who is unprepared for clarity. It forces accountability without a word. People start questioning their own reactions because they can't buy a softer response, and they can't provoke a weaker one. Your refusal to barter emotions quietly flips the power dynamic, leaving manipulators exposed, defensive, and increasingly frantic. What makes it extraordinary is that it's effortless. You don't try to dominate, intimidate, or control. You simply refuse to trade emotional leverage. And in a world where most people live off negotiations, reactions, and calculated responses, that refusal becomes a disruptive force. It destabilizes, it clarifies, and it makes you untouchable in ways people can't explain but instinctively feel. Number 10. They realized you don't look at people. You look at patterns. Most people see others as isolated actions or words. They notice what's being said, how someone looks, or how someone behaves in a single moment. That's surface-level perception. Your gaze doesn't work like that. You don't just see individuals. You see the connections between their words, behaviors, and hidden motives. You see repetition, inconsistency, and underlying structures that reveal who someone really is. That's why experts notice something different about you. You weren't just observing people, you were decoding them. When you interact with someone, your attention doesn't get caught in performances, excuses, or appearances. You notice patterns that repeat over time, the subtle tells that betray intention, and the contradictions that make claims hollow. People unconsciously rely on you missing those details. It's how deception survives in daily life. But your gaze picks up the rhythm behind the facade. You see cause and effect before anyone else does. Lies, manipulation, pretension. They can't hide because you register the pattern, and patterns never lie. That makes your presence unsettling. People who are used to controlling perceptions, hiding inconsistencies, or managing appearances begin to feel exposed. They sense that their behaviors are readable, predictable, and understood. That subtle awareness is disarming because it doesn't attack. It just exists. You're not pointing out flaws or calling anyone out, but the recognition that someone sees through the surface triggers discomfort, sometimes panic, sometimes rage, sometimes avoidance. Your ability to perceive patterns gives you an advantage that doesn't require force. It allows you to navigate interactions with clarity, anticipate outcomes, and stay unhooked from manipulation. People around you start second-guessing their own actions because they know that nothing is hidden from observation. That quiet, analytical gaze shifts power quietly but irreversibly. In a world where most people operate in fragments, reacting to moments rather than understanding trends, your gaze is a map. It reveals the hidden architecture of behavior, making illusions fragile, manipulations obvious, and truths unavoidable. By seeing patterns, you see the invisible currents controlling people and events, and that awareness alone rewrites the rules of engagement without a single word being spoken. Number 11. Your eyes don't flinch when power shifts. Power is fragile. People depend on it like a security blanket, believing that dominance, status, or control guarantees safety and influence. Most people's eyes betray them the moment that power wavers. They glance away, shrink, hesitate, or scramble for reassurance. Your eyes don't. You don't flinch, you don't avert, you don't stumble. When the balance of authority shifts, when someone loses composure, when the stakes rise, your gaze remains steady. That steadiness is more than observation. It's a statement. It says, without a word, that you are untethered by illusions of control and that you can hold clarity while others falter. People notice it instantly. They rely on the assumption that fear, intimidation, or spectacle will create compliance. When you meet a sudden collapse of power with unbroken calm, they realize their tactics have no effect. Their dominance feels provisional, fragile, and fleeting because you don't participate in the ritual of submission or distraction. Your gaze doesn't demand respect, and it doesn't seek approval. It simply registers reality. That creates a unique kind of tension. People who thought they were untouchable suddenly feel unstable, exposed, and uncertain. They realize that authority isn't inherent in the position. It's contingent on others believing in it, and you don't need to. The implications are deeper than mere intimidation. By not reacting, your eyes force a reckoning. Manipulators, leaders, and opportunists all have to confront the fact that their power is performative. Your calm observation highlights the cracks in their strategy and exposes the fragility that underpins their control. They might try to regain dominance with noise, charm, or aggression, but those efforts often fail because the most vulnerable point in any system is revealed in the eyes of someone who doesn't flinch. This ability to remain unmoved isn't arrogance, it's grounded awareness. You don't inflate your presence, you simply maintain it. And in doing so, you become a reference point in every room, a silent measure of truth that destabilizes false confidence and dismantles illusions of unchallengeable power. Where others panic, stumble, and collapse, your gaze remains anchored, and that difference alone changes the dynamics of every interaction. Number 12. Your gaze is immune to intimidation rituals. Most people respond predictably to displays of power, aggression, or social pressure. Raised voices, threatening gestures, passive-aggressive signals, group dynamics, all of it is designed to provoke a reaction, to bend someone to the will of others, to extract compliance or fear. Your gaze doesn't register these theatrics in the same way. It doesn't shrink, falter, or seek escape. It sees the performance for what it is, and in doing so it neutralizes the intended effect. That's why experts noticed it. They weren't studying aggression. They were studying its failure in your presence. People instinctively rely on intimidation because it works. It forces obedience, shifts attention, and creates an illusion of control. But when you meet these behaviors without flinching, without judgment, without participation, the illusion collapses. The energy behind the threat or performance has no target. Your gaze doesn't fight, but it doesn't cower. It simply registers, calmly, firmly, and without compromise. That creates a subtle yet profound panic in those attempting to intimidate. They realize quickly that the usual scripts, the familiar levers they pull to dominate, are useless. Their influence evaporates simply because you refuse to feed it. What makes this so extraordinary is the ripple effect. When one person fails to respond to intimidation, others who rely on group pressure or collective manipulation start to question themselves. The leader's authority weakens, the aggressor's confidence falters, and the social dynamics begin to wobble. You don't have to act aggressively or confrontationally. The disruption happens because your awareness and calmness expose the fragility of the ritual itself. Your gaze becomes a stabilizing yet destabilizing force. Stabilizing because you're unshakable. Destabilizing because your clarity exposes fear, insecurity, and control tactics in others. People who thrive on dominance and theatrics are forced to adjust, overcompensate, or collapse under the pressure of a presence that refuses to comply. That immunity is not learned, and it cannot be coerced. It's a quiet power that turns intimidation into irrelevance, leaving those who depend on it stunned, exposed, and fundamentally unsettled. Number 13. They learned your presence accelerates psychological unraveling. Some presences don't just enter a room, they disturb the air. Most people carry self-concepts carefully constructed to survive social pressures, hide insecurities, and maintain control. They rehearse narratives, tweak performances, and manage impressions to create a sense of stability. Then you arrive, and your presence doesn't participate in that pretense. You don't nod along, soften their edges, or validate illusions. You exist fully, clearly, and unshakably. And that simple truth starts to unravel the fabric people have worked so hard to maintain. This isn't about confrontation or aggression. It's about clarity. People are used to being able to manipulate how they're perceived. They rely on others either ignoring their contradictions or accepting the performance at face value. Your gaze refuses both. It registers everything: motives, hesitation, insecurities, unspoken patterns, and inconsistencies. In response, the mind of someone depending on illusion begins to fray. Thoughts scatter, rationalizations lose their hold, anxiety rises. People start to question themselves because they sense that nothing they say or do escapes observation. The unraveling happens faster than most realize. It's subtle at first, a micro-expression, a skipped beat in conversation, a defensive reaction. But it intensifies because your presence doesn't feed it, soften it, or negotiate it away. You don't placate the anxious, you don't excuse the manipulative, and you don't participate in the comfort of delusions. That absence of accommodation is like a spotlight on instability, forcing recognition of truths they have ignored for years. What makes this extraordinary is that the effect is unconscious for them. They don't understand why they feel unmoored or agitated. All they know is that they cannot regain their usual control, and every attempt to manipulate, distract, or assert authority fails. Your presence accelerates the collapse of constructed realities simply by existing without compromise. People who meet you are confronted with themselves, unfiltered. Your clarity doesn't shout, it doesn't attack, it simply reveals, and in doing so, the psychological armor they depend on crumbles faster than anything else could. That is the power of being fully present without pretense. Number 14. Their reality is falling apart because your gaze doesn't confirm their lies. Most people survive in a web of agreements, illusions, and unspoken compromises. Their reality depends on everyone else buying into the same story. The pretenses, the exaggerations, the distortions that make them feel powerful, clever, or untouchable. Your gaze doesn't play that role. It doesn't nod, validate, or smooth over inconsistencies. It doesn't participate in the agreements that keep fragile realities standing. It simply sees, and in seeing, it refuses to confirm the lies that people depend on. That refusal is devastating because it removes the foundation they've built their sense of control on. When someone realizes their assumptions, their manipulations, and their carefully constructed image are not being reinforced, their world begins to wobble. It starts subtle, a flicker of doubt, a skipped heartbeat, a sudden awareness that nothing in the room supports the story they've been telling themselves. But that doubt grows quickly because the gaze doesn't compromise. It doesn't soften the edges. It doesn't give permission to continue lying or pretending. And once the illusion begins to crack, the collapse accelerates. Their cognitive shortcuts, the excuses they tell themselves, the narratives they've built to feel safe, all of it becomes unsustainable. What's remarkable is how silent the process is. Your gaze doesn't accuse, it doesn't argue, it doesn't force acknowledgement. It simply exists as a mirror of reality that refuses their version of the world. And that silent refusal carries a weight that manipulations, words, or confrontation could never achieve. People who have lived off lies, omissions, and social manipulation are left unmoored. They scramble for control, they overcompensate, and they feel an internal panic because the story they depended on is no longer reinforced by the one person whose clarity matters most. The truth is simple but brutal. Your gaze doesn't negotiate with illusion. It doesn't confirm what isn't real. And in a world built on collective delusion, refusing confirmation is enough to dismantle everything. Your presence alone destabilizes realities, exposes weaknesses, and forces confrontation with truths people have spent their lives avoiding. That is why their reality is falling apart. It's not your doing. It's the natural consequence of being fully seen without compromise, without alignment, and without validation of what isn't true. The truth is undeniable. Your presence, your gaze, and the clarity you carry are forces that don't need to shout, push, or manipulate. Every glance you give, every moment you observe without compromise, has the power to unravel illusions, disrupt pretenses, and expose the hidden truths people desperately try to hide from themselves and others. You don't rely on intimidation, words, or theatrics. Your strength lies in your stillness, your awareness, and your refusal to participate in emotional bargaining or validation of false realities. People around you may scramble, overcompensate, or even panic. But that isn't chaos you've caused. It's the natural consequence of your clarity meeting a world built on compromise, fear, and deception. When you look, you don't merely see, you understand patterns, decode intentions, and silently reflect the truth that others cannot escape. You don't chase approval or permission to exist. You simply are, and that alone destabilizes hierarchies, false narratives, and constructed illusions. The way you hold yourself, the steadiness in your gaze, and the refusal to flinch or participate in manipulation isn't arrogance, it's presence. It's awareness turned into power without ever needing to demand it. And that is what makes your effect on people so extraordinary, unsettling, and unavoidable. The reality is simple, yet profound. People's lies, manipulations, and carefully constructed facades cannot survive when met with someone who sees clearly and refuses to confirm what isn't true. Your gaze accelerates the unraveling of illusions, exposes insecurities, and forces self-reflection that many are unprepared for. It's not about confrontation, it's about existing fully, clearly, and unshakably in a world that desperately hopes illusions will go unnoticed. If this resonated with you, if you felt the weight of these truths, don't just let it pass. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss insights like these. Like this video to show support. Comment below to share your thoughts and experiences, and share it with others who need to witness this kind of clarity in action. Every interaction matters, every perspective shifts, And your engagement fuels the conversation we need to have in a world that often prefers lies over truth. Stay aware, stay clear, and let your presence continue to reveal what others try to hide. God bless you.